luego. Really good to be here. I want to thank everyone for the opportunity here. I want to thank the board and Paulette for inviting me to speak here and share my thoughts today. Kahnawà for the words to open us up, and to you, Simon, for the work you're doing in running our event today, and to everybody who's part of this for being here and for putting your minds together and for the work you do in the community. So it's a great honor for me to be asked to open up the conference and sharing some thoughts on the themes that were outlined. It's very interesting listening to Paulette's introduction and looking at the issues that are being brought to the center of your discussions here, because these are all issues, of course, that are central and so important to not only the work we do, but in the lives that we're living as Umwehunwe, as Indigenous people today. You know, we're all thinking about these questions that come out of having had I was going to say the opportunity, but being forced to really think about the work that we do in an entirely different way, given the pandemic and the things that we've experienced and the lessons that we've learned. And so what I hope to do for you in the next half hour or so is to share some thoughts to help you think through in maybe a slightly different way some of the questions that are being put forward in the conference here. And just want to say I'm coming to you today from a dark place that's just getting light now on the West Coast in the beautiful territory of the Saanich Nation. And so I can just see the sun coming up over the ocean here. So I want to thank my hosts again, Haichka CM, to the Saanich people who have hosted me here for 20-something years now, bouncing back and forth between my home community of Kahnawà and Victoria. So the experience I have with the work that you all do is not as an administrator. I've never professionally worked as a educational administrator, but as I was thinking about sharing my thoughts here, I wanted to again honor the work that you do, because I couldn't really think about being the person that I am and doing the work that I've done and having the impact that I've had, I think, in the landscape and the cultural and political landscape of our nations, without the solid work and commitment and passion of people who run the education system in my community. And I'm thinking about people like Kenneth Deere, Eddie Cross, and Laura Norton, if any of you know Kahnawà, and people that have been through our community will know the impact that the people who took charge of our education system in the 1970s and made it a vehicle and an instrument of self-determination rather than an instrument of colonization, have been probably, excuse me, probably the most revolutionary people in our community. And I recently had a discussion with the people that were involved in what's called the Kahnawà Combined Schools Committee in the 1970s, when the parents and the people who were working in the system recognized how important it was for the survival of our nation and the strength of our community to really take charge and do education in a way that has come to be accepted as the way education should be done, with culture, with language, with land-based practice, with simply infusing a sense of Mohawkness into the institutions of education in our community. The impact that those people have had, not only in Kahnawà, but in our nation, in the Haudenosaunee, and then across the country, has been truly revolutionary in really turning the tide of history from where it was headed, which was, I would say, towards the extermination of our people, with all these assimilated processes and policies and ideas and lies and falsehoods that had gone into creation of a sense of who we are through the education system that was put in place by the Department of Indian Affairs and by the churches, and turning that around and making our education system a vehicle and a place and a space, as Paulette referenced, where young Indigenous children, in my case, young Mohawk children, could come to begin to start to realize who they truly were. So taking that education system and making it an instrument of self-determination as opposed to an instrument of termination of our nationhood was, in my mind, even as a historian, as someone who looks at politics, someone who analyzes the broad trends in the relationship between our people and other people, this is something that was crucial for the survival of our nations. And now I'm sitting here, and generations now of people have come through that system, knowing who they are, not in the fullest sense, because we still have work to do, as we all know, not fully realized as a Ongwe Hunwe or a Ganyakahaga, but someone who understands himself in a much better way than previous generations had the opportunity to do, having gone through systems of education and training and indoctrination to become something that served the interests and fit the mold that was created by a society that had very bad intentions for us, as opposed to the vision of our ancestors. So when I think about the work you do, that's what I think. And I want to honor you all for that work. And hopefully I can make a small contribution in the next few minutes here to that continuing journey of making education a powerful instrument for our people all across the country. The theme that I was asked to speak on, Indigenous education and leadership in the post-pandemic future, is something that we're all thinking through. So I don't want to say that I have the answer. I have a set of thoughts, and I've been dealing with the same issues that everybody else has been dealing with. I guess I have had the luxury of having a job where I can sit back and think about it and reflect on it. And I want to share those reflections, and it's kind of the current state of my understanding. And I look forward to, if we have the chance, whether it's here or in the context of this conference, or even if anybody wants to contact me later and continue our discussion, I look forward to that and hearing what you think about all this. But for me, in terms of us as Indigenous leaders and educators, the effect of the pandemic has been to clarify some things that we already knew. Yeah, we knew that our communities need to take care of each other. Mike can clarify the word for me after, if he wants to, or even jump in right now in terms of our word for self-determination around the root of Dewatatawi or something like that. I'm not a fluent speaker, but I know that the root of it is that we take care of each other. And for me, the experience in the pandemic has been to show how tenuous, how fragile, and how dependent on technology and travel and in capitalism and so forth, all those other relationships are. You know, the relationships we have all over the world, the relationships we have and the dependencies we have with other institutions kind of fall away when something like this hits. And the relationships that matter come into sharp focus. The relationships that matter are things that we experience all around us. So who is it in our life that matters? Who is it that's important? Who do we depend on? Who do we want to take care of? Those kind of questions in the course of this whole pandemic, I think in our personal life and in our collective life as nations, have become very sharply focused. And so in the pandemic, in terms of leadership, the lesson that I think we've learned in our communities is that we take care of each other, and that's even more important. We need to reroot ourselves. We need to kind of, the word being redouble our commitments to really making sure that our communities are solid, that our communities are strong, that our relationships are healthy in order to survive whatever's coming next. There is that sense of uncertainty. There's a sense of uncertainty. There's this kind of underlying, I won't say fear, but there's an uncertainty. There's a sense that things are changing. We don't know where it's going. There's a future that's out there, but it's strewn with obstacles, and it has things that are daunting. And I think everyone feels that. And so that, to me, puts us in a situation where the rest of the world, or the rest of the country, I should say, is feeling what Indigenous peoples have always felt. 500 years now, we've been feeling uncertainty. We've been feeling that the future is not clear, that we don't have a choice, that things are coming from the outside into our circle and putting obstacles in the way of our health and prosperity and so forth. That's colonialism. That's the elements of colonialism and the experience of it for our people. So the reality of the post-pandemic future and the reality of the pandemic, in my experience and thinking through it, is something that we have had experience with for a long time now. And so in confronting this, if you look at the lessons that have been learned and the things that our people have done to simply survive, we categorize them in today's vocabulary as the elements of resiliency, as was expressed by Paulette. We've learned lessons about resiliency. We've learned lessons about the choices that need to be made in order to stay strong and healthy and to survive and persist as nations and individuals into the future in the face of very daunting challenges. So the pandemic, to me, is part of that long history of assaults upon our ability to continue in a happy, healthy way. And this one is the result of nature. And our people have faced that as well in the past. So when I'm trying to think through lessons for leadership and how do we orient ourselves in terms of choices we make in education, and what do we want to pass on, and what do we want to focus on in our educational system so that we can create generations of people that have those qualities to be able to withstand and thrive in the future. I don't feel lost in looking for answers, because all I need to do is look back to what the choices were that our ancestors made, whether it was in the 70s in terms of the people that I just mentioned and in making those choices and facing that threat of assimilation, or going further back generationally into what kind of things did they do? What kind of choices did our ancestors make in order to continue to exist on our land when many, many powerful forces were oriented to taking them off that land and actually dispersing them as people, not only physically, but culturally and politically as well. So the answer is in rerouting and staying connected. And when we talk about decolonization, that word is often used. I've used it myself, and I think it's generally understood in terms of the effort to confront what colonization is, in terms of those disconnections and policies and actions and attitudes to disconnect us from who we are, to disconnect us from the land, to disconnect us from our ancestors, and to disconnect us so that we're scattered and not powerful. If that's colonization, and I believe it is, decolonization is the restoration of all of those connections. There's actions, there's decisions, there's things that we do, there's choices we make as people on an individual level and on a collective level that begin to make those connections again. One of the central metaphors and stories and images that we're brought up with in our nation when you think about these things is about the fire of our nations being so strong at one point, that the fire consisting in, if you will, the wood and the thing feeding that fire being our languages, our cultures, our traditions, our families, our clans, and our ceremonies and so forth. And that keeps the strength of our fire very bright and very warm. And around that fire, protecting it, you have the circle of our chiefs and clan mothers and our knowledge holders. And what colonialism has done has weakened that circle protecting that fire so that outside forces have come in over time. So our fire has been weakened because the circle of culture and language and strength over time, over periods of generations, has been weakened to the point where outside influences with bad intentions have come in the midst of that Gawadzare, that family, and that fire, and have done their intentions towards our nation or our fire. And at first it was just one, and we could withstand it. But over time, as we know, colonization has been multiple forces: racism, the Indian Act, greed, capitalism, unfortunately, the intentions of the church, residential school, and so forth. And so where we once had a strong fire, strong families, strong nations, strong communities, piece by piece, the elements of that fire have been assaulted and taken away and dispersed to the point now, at one point, all we had left were the embers glowing, and it wasn't a strong fire. And you can look across this country, across the world really, with Indigenous people, and you can see that at some places and in some communities, in some spaces, there's hardly anything left. So when we think about decolonization, how do we confront that? How do we preserve that fire and get it going strong again? There's a lot of different approaches. There's a lot of different ideas that come from all over the world that can be brought to bear on this question. But we can't neglect the core and the most important thing when it comes to decolonization, which is the restoration of the strength of that community, so to the restoration of the strength of those fires, those families, those clans. And the thing that makes those strong are the languages, the cultures, the ceremonies, the traditions, and the land-based cultural practices that are the actual essences of who we are as a people, and those connections to the land. So decolonization, when I talk about reconnecting, that's to me a very strong way of thinking about what the priority should be and how we position ourselves in relation to this process. And just as the fires need to be re-strengthened, that circle of knowledge holder, of governance, of law, of traditional authorities, that needs to be strengthened as well. So decolonization is really this almost all-encompassing process of focusing on what the core is and re-strengthening that fire. The difference, though, between that time when our fires were attacked and reduced to embers, and today, is that we live in a completely different political environment, technological environment, and so forth. And so when we talk about traditional government ceremonies and so forth, that's the core. But I believe there needs to be another circle that's built around that, because the work of restoring that is not the work of me as an educator, whether I'm working in the university, working in an education system in the community or so forth. It's not the work of lawyers per se. It's not the work of people who are involved in public policy and so forth. That's us as an individual to contribute to that. We are part of that process and we do what we can. But that circle of traditional government also needs to be protected, empowered, and facilitated in its growth by another circle, which is the work that we do as the people who are engaging in systems and in processes with that outside society. Because it's not 1800, it's not 1700, it's 2021 heading into 2022. And we have a whole set of technological challenges and legal challenges and all kinds of other challenges from the outside, which people like ourselves are qualified to confront. And that's our contribution to the restoration of nationhood. People who do the work that we do, the work that you do, the work that I do, is in linking the restoration of that fire and the strengthening of our culture and language and land-based practices and ceremonies and so forth that invite our people back into a context of nationhood that can reroute them in who they are and strengthen themselves and decolonize them as individuals. Invite them into that context of nationhood and restored nationhood by creating the space and giving the ability of those people to do that work. We do the work that we do. So we facilitate that. That's the way I think about work in this context of institutions and organizations. And so the elements for me in a post-pandemic future to focus on really center around an understanding of what decolonization is in this framing that I've just explained. In confronting it on an individual level, we're confronting the same old thing that we've always confronted. There's falsehoods, there's lies, and there's the psychophysical effects of really a genocidal history and continuing racism. As an individual, every one of our young people need to be taught, need to be trained, need to be educated in their history, in their culture, in their language, so as to be able to withstand the continuing effects which manifest themselves psychologically and physically of the racist agenda that the Canadian society has towards our people. And we have to admit that it's abated somewhat in the last few years. We are in an era of reconciliation. The most obvious surface levels of aggression and racism towards our people have been addressed. And there has been some progress in this. But the big debate today is systemic racism. And it's not only in Quebec where Kahnawà and Apuzasne interacted, it's all over the place. And there is a systemic racism that continually grinds down our people. And the efforts at education in our communities, I think, really need to acknowledge that, really need to develop and train our young people in strategies on how to confront that so that they are not affected in the mental level and in the physical level, because it has been shown through research, mainly in the United States, that dealing with racism on a daily basis and in a systemic way creates physical effects that undermine the strength and health of people as they go through their lives. And so to me, when we're thinking about education, it's a very important aspect of what we need to focus on. So on an individual level, language, history of knowledge, rerouting to cultural practices based on the land so as to create and reinforce that connection to territory, and not only on a physical and psychological level, but on a spiritual level as well. Those are the crucial elements of that individual process. On a collective level, and here we often neglect, I think, in a kind of Western way of doing education in mainstream institutions and public school system and so forth, the emphasis in this era of reconciliation seems to be on, if there is an effort to focus on resiliency and decolonization, it's on that individual kind of, it's with that individual lens that people look at it. So they do focus on the rights of the individual. They want to care about Native children. They want to care about Native people. But making the leap in terms of understanding the strength and ability of an Indigenous person to survive and thrive in this world in the context of their own nation, in their collective identity as a Ongwehongwe person, as a Kahnawà person, or a Cree person, or an Anishinaabe person, that you really can only survive and thrive as Ongwehongwe, as an Indigenous person in the context of nationhood, that you can't do decolonization just as an individual. It has to be paired with the decolonization of the relationship between the Indigenous community, the collectivities, and those other forces that are out there trying to diminish that. So we need to, in bringing our understanding forward, also focus on that it's a futile effort at decolonization to simply focus on the success of the child and not address and not contribute to the decolonization of the relationship between our nation and the Canadian government. And the elements of that are clear, and I think everybody kind of knows this in looking at restoration of our governments, recognition of our laws, but also as we begin to develop and gain success in this path of decolonization, we confront a challenge as Indigenous people, and taking the reins of those controls and taking charge of that space that's vacated by the colonizer, so that we begin to be the ones that control decisions and so forth. How are we going to do it? Here's another level of challenge. is, are we simply going to do it as Indigenous people doing educational administration or government or business in the same way that's out there? Or are we going to, again, go through this process of decolonizing our minds and institutions? Because I think one of the serious problems that we confront as Indigenous people, and we're all Indigenous here speaking on this question, so I can be a bit blunt, is the organizational culture that has been created in the wake of colonization, and the governance structures that are not so solid as we go forward. And this is not pointing blame at ourselves, or this is a natural step in the process. And I think that where there are problems in organizational cultures and where there are problems in governance of our own institutions by our own people, it's because that balance between individual decolonization and the organizational decolonization hasn't been paid enough attention to. And so people make up organizations, people make up institutions, and we need to really focus on that. And so for me, when we think about the new leaders that we're trying to create in the work that we do, it seems like we need ancestral wisdom infusing their worldview, shaping their identity, creating their mental frameworks. We need to honor the resiliency of our ancestors by creating capacities and environments so that these new leaders can thrive and put their good minds to creating solutions to the challenges that we don't even yet know are coming in our communities. And that's the best work that we can do as educators and elders and knowledge holders in our community. And I'll leave you with those thoughts for today. Now I'll go Adaneto.